it would be almost impossible to, completely describe everything that you felt when you got there and you actually stepped foot into country. And I remember in the first week, we quickly went through a maturing process where we were pretty confident in our ability. We didn't quite know how that ability was going to stack up in a place like Afghanistan, knowing the history of other, Russian and British experiences. It was clear that we were fighting Al-Qaeda. We understood the relationship between Al-Qaeda and Taliban, and understood that really that invasion was to remove that safe haven in a countering terrorism role, removing that safe haven, and the Taliban were, with that organisation that had agreed to provide that safe haven, or at least were complicit in providing it. The Taliban were obviously very strong in the south, and less so the further you progress to the north. And so people were more willing, I think, to speak out when you spoke with them the further north you went. And they had enough. They've learned to live with oppression, I think, over the years, and so they understand that sometimes they can't speak out in order to save themselves and their families, but they'd had enough. Air movements were by night in those stages because of the threat, surface-to-air missile threat that was perceived. But when you did actually get a look at the ground, I've since reflected when I fly across Australia that I'll tell you there's some areas of South Australia in the middle of Australia that don't look too different from Afghanistan, but it's very rough, very difficult terrain, and I think just the weather conditions, when combined, make it one of the hardest environments in the world. Overnight temperatures were minus 19, minus 20 degrees. And of course, we were at that stage using our long-range patrol vehicles with no roof, no windscreen. We'd taken them directly as we had them from Australia. And so when I added wind chill, I think we worked out the worst we hit was about minus 35 on a move by night. And in fact, it became that difficult or that dangerous, in fact, to move by night just because of the cold. I used to have to stop and prevent people moving by night. It was just too dangerous. The climate was actually too dangerous. So the locals weren't able to differentiate Australians from Americans. They referred to us all as Americans, and I think from memory we tried at the start to explain it, and it was lost. It was I'm not sure many of them actually knew where and what Australia was, and so we didn't try. Although we did have our own camouflage uniforms. In fact, that was the first time Australia rolled out its own desert pattern uniform, mirroring the sort of the pattern that we always wear, but in desert. I found it unbelievable that a country that had been through what that country had been through and has been through, the people are as receptive as they are. I mean, it's in their culture to welcome you as a stranger into their house, into their world. But at that stage, I recall driving through little towns and villages and probably being the first coalition forces that people had seen. And on one hand, I saw the older generations look at us like, as if to say, you're just the latest in a long line of foreign forces that I've seen come through this country and through my backyard. Prior to Operation Anaconda, we spent a lot of time doing long-range special reconnaissance to really give commanders an idea of what was going on, what was the effect, where were the pockets of Al-Qaeda, of Taliban, and making sure that we were contributing to the knowledge to allow coalition forces to take the next step and plan future operations. I mean, in the first tour, we were fighting terrorism, countering terrorism, removing a safe haven. And that obviously shifted into countering an insurgency, which has a different approach. And so it wasn't like the whole squadron was intensively fighting for that whole operation. That's not the case, and wouldn't be the case for an operation that was as long as that was. But as I said, for some it was, and mainly where we were positioned high in mountain tops. It was high altitude. It was very cold. A lot of the patrols were static, and that has its own problems in extreme cold. But we were calling in a lot of air support to support the US conventional troops that were doing a lot of the fighting through objectives. We obviously contributed early on when there were downed aircraft and people that were missing. Our patrol members were in positions and vantage points where they could see some of what was going on, and were able to direct coalition aircraft to lay fire onto Al-Qaeda positions. We had to extend them in their positions beyond the duration that we had sent them in for. So in one particular case, I had sent a patrol in with a certain duration, and I had to extend them in that position because their vantage point was so critical to support those, again, I said largely US soldiers down in the valley and on the ground. I just couldn't pull them out. And I had to speak to them on a daily basis to get an understanding of how much food they had left. And consistently, their feedback was, well, look, we've halved the rations that we halved yesterday, and we'll halve them again tomorrow to stay where we are because we know what we're doing is so critical. Their training does come to the fore in those really difficult environments. But that said, I only had a handful of what I would term sort of cold weather warfare specialists. And, and I had to use those soldiers sparingly. And essentially those soldiers trained the rest of the squadron before we left in how to operate in a cold, mountainous environment. Not just survive, but actually operate and do the job that we had to do. So the bulk of the squadron had very little training in operating in mountainous, cold environments, and in some cases found themselves trudging through 3 to 4 feet of snow to get to positions and then live in that environment. And essentially those soldiers trained the rest of the squadron before we left in how to operate in a cold, mountainous environment. Not just survive, but actually operate and do the job that we had to do. So the bulk of the squadron had very little training in operating in mountainous, cold environments, and in some cases found themselves trudging through 3 to 4 feet of snow to get to positions and then live in that environment. There was no colour in the first tour, not at all. There was, in fact, it was quite unbelievable. It was black, it was grey, it was Hessian. That was it. And when I went back, that had changed. There was colour, which might sound like a small thing, but it makes a difference. In the first tour, we drove past a group of children, and we waved at them. They waved back, and an old man came out and started throwing rocks at the female. It was a female child who had waved back to us. Started not stoning her, but throwing rocks at her. Such was, the way the country was, and that sort of thing wasn't happening in 2007. In 2007, and in fact in later tours, I watched operations take place, not just necessarily Australian operations, but operations take place where key Taliban individuals were removed from a village, and the very next day at the markets, women that had been wearing burqas the day before were not wearing burqas 24 hours later. Yeah, our special forces absolutely felt that we were succeeding militarily. I think, and certainly in 2001, 2002, obviously we were a part of the invasion that secured the country, and started, I suppose, the process that has been enduring ever since. And I would say ever since then, and I can't speak for others, but certainly my observation is the operations in Afghanistan have been very successful and have made a real change and a real difference. I suppose my enduring impressions of Afghanistan would be that more than any other place I've been, it's a place where you can have your best days and your worst days all in the one day. Terrain, weather, coincidence, and things that you just don't see coming can all combine in one day to make life very difficult. The other enduring reflection on Afghanistan is the people and the generosity of the people. And whilst sometimes it's difficult to comprehend the Pashtun culture, that warrior culture, and why an Afghan male would at one point be tending his crop and half an hour later be shooting at you, it's difficult to comprehend. Both soldiers and anyone, difficult to comprehend why that is. And then later on welcome you into his home. It's the Pashtun warrior culture, and for him not to do what he did would be to shame himself and his family. And I think our contribution is highly valued and has been highly valued since that first tour. We certainly regarded it as our responsibility to establish the reputation of the Australian Defence Force when we arrived in 2001. We certainly felt that we did that, and that has been enhanced over time. And so, and my reflection or reflections from coalition members that I've interacted with over the years in Afghanistan is that they've always been struck by the professionalism of a defence force that they probably knew little about prior to their service there, and prior to their service in that ISAF coalition. So I'm not sure that numbers matter. Certainly professionalism matters, and it's clear to me that we're highly regarded for that by our coalition partners.